Fihas. I'm an acting director of the Institute of Ecumenical Studies. It's my pleasure to have the second lecture within the Ecumenical School for Dialogue about the war in Ukraine and rethinking peacebuilding approaches. Our second lecture will be dedicated to the ecumenical landscape of Ukraine, and I will present you the situation which we have before 2022, when before the Russian full-scale aggression, and afterwards we will make some conclusions. We will see how the situation was changed after the war, and we will analyze the challenges and prospects, perspectives for ecumenical dialogue in Ukraine, which also will foster could foster peace-building initiatives of the churches. So I will share with you my presentation. Can you see it? It's fine. So,
yes.
Yes. So I call it doomed to dialogue. On the picture, you can see the heads of the main churches in Ukraine. Two Orthodox churches and one Greek Catholics, when they come together to commemorate the victims of the big famine happened in Ukraine in 1932-33, when several millions of people were artificially died because of the famine created by the communist regime. So we will speak about the ecumenical situation in Ukraine before 2022. This is the picture in Saint Sophia. This is one of the oldest cathedral in Ukraine, and also from time to time the leaders of the churches and other religious denominations come together in the occasion of some big celebration. In that case, it was an independence of Ukraine in August 24. So, as you know, Ukraine got its independence as a state in 1891. So before it, Ukraine was under the communist regime. Depends on what part, but the biggest part of Ukraine was under occupation more than 50 years, around 70 years, starting from 20s up to 1991. So around 70 years it was under communist regime. It was a harsh times for Ukrainians in their religious life, because a lot of churches in 1830s were totally even destroyed. So around 80% in central and eastern Ukraine churches were brutally destroyed by the communist propaganda. All the seminaries were closed. The only church that could arrive to exist was the Russian Orthodox Church, and for Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was forbidden and existed only in the as an underground church. It was persecuted as well. Most of the Protestant communities also were persecuted during many years. According to the statistic, when my own church, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, after the Second World War, had around 3,000 priests. In the 1990s, we had only 300, so 10 times less, and most of the priests were elderly priests. No theological life during this time, because the churches strive to survive during those hard times. And only in 1991, when Ukraine managed to have its independence, the religious life flourished. And as during the USSR time, the religious lives were forbidden, and in the 90s, it was allowed, and all the people in former communists went to the churches. So the churches were, the rest of the churches that still were preserved were full of people. When I entered a seminary, for example, in 1997, we had 4 candidates on one place, and my course had 45 students. So 45 students on the first course, and 5 persons per one place. So it was very hard to enter the seminary and to be a priest. Right now, it is the number of the candidates wanted to be pastors, priests, diminishing. But in 90s, the religious life was really flourishing. The churches were have been opening, and what was very like a unique characteristic for Ukraine, that I'm not sure that I record my lecture. It is recorded, fine. And very unique characteristic of the religious life of Ukraine was it multi-denominational existence. So in Ukraine, for example, to compare with Russia, where Russian Orthodox Church has a complete number of its believers, of its faithful, and it was the biggest church in Russia. That's why it became to collaborate close to the states. In Ukraine, it was opposite. We didn't have only one Orthodox church as in Russia. We have several Orthodox churches. I will show you later what kind of the churches, and we have Catholics, Protestants, and Muslims communities in Ukraine. So none of the church could dictate its power for another churches, and we have to deal with each other. And in the beginning of the 90s, it was causes many clashes between the churches, between the religious communities, because, for example, in one city or in one village would be one church, and there were 2, for example, communities, Greek Catholics or Orthodox, or 2 different Orthodox denominations, which want to have this church after 1991. And sometimes it caused clashes. But after all, in the late 90s, every community managed to build its own shrine and to have the place where they can worship. So since that time, religious, theological, spiritual life in Ukraine was developed. What kind of churches we can see in Ukraine? So from the beginning of the 90s, we had 3 Orthodox churches, and 3 of them didn't have Eucharistic communion between each other. The first one and the biggest one was the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate. It was this church was a part of the Russian Orthodox Church, and so it has a sort of independent state in Ukraine, but it was never like autocephalous church. And when, for example, it was a presentation of the Russian Orthodox Church outside, for example, in the WCC, in the World Council of Churches, Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate never sent her own delegates, but they were always a part of the Russian Orthodox Church. This church preserved its canonicity because of its link with Moscow. Yes, so it's very important. Another church was the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Kyiv Patriarchate. It was a smaller church, but it was also Orthodox church. And because of many Ukrainians since the beginning of its independence didn't want to have any communion with Moscow, so they created their own Orthodox Church with the center in Kiev. And now you can understand why many Ukrainians didn't want anything common with Moscow, because for centuries Moscow tried to control not only religious but political life in Ukraine, and controlling the church life was one of the soft power of Kremlin of Moscow for many ages. That's why this church was they cut their link with the Moscow, because most of the priests were from the Moscow Patriarchate, but they said we are creating our own church with the support of some churches from America and from Canada, because there is several Ukrainian Orthodox churches in America and Canada, which has the links with Constantinople. But those two churches, Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Kiev Patriarchate and Ukrainian Autocephalic Orthodox Church, these two churches, they didn't have any recognition from the part of the world Orthodoxy. They were just only created in Ukraine, and they didn't receive any recognition from the other Orthodox churches, only for one reason, because the Russian Orthodox Church blocked all these initiatives. When some links, some priests or some bishops try to have network, always Orthodox, other Orthodox representatives, always Vatican, always some other churches, the delegates of the ROC said that we will cut off all the ecumenical relationships with you when you will have a sort of relations with other non-canonical Orthodox Church in Ukraine. So always, sometimes they blame them that they are Nazi church or something like that, what they're doing today with Ukrainians. So in the beginning, we'll have 3 Orthodox churches, and they didn't have any communication between themselves, and there was a struggle. It's interesting that while Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Kiev Patriarchate or Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Autocephalic Orthodox Church recognized baptism from Moscow Patriarchate, nevertheless, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate didn't recognize even baptism of other Ukrainian churches. They rebaptized it, so completely complete separation. So coming to Catholics, we had Catholics, mostly not Roman, Latin Rite Catholics, but most of the Catholics in Ukraine from the beginning were Byzantine Rite Catholics, that is Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And also we have a small Greek Catholic Church in Mukachevo. So this Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church has around 10% of all the faithful in Ukraine. Coming to Protestants, most of the Protestants in Ukraine, 95% are new wave of Protestantism, mostly Pentecostals and Baptists. We had also traditional German Lutheran Church, which was Ukrainian, but it's only several parishes. But most of the Protestants are Pentecostals and Baptists. And in the beginning, they were not very ecumenically open. They rebaptized all the participants coming from the traditional churches. That's why in the beginning it was it was a problem of these churches to have some dialogue with the other churches. They call themselves the only church which is valid to exist here. As well in Ukraine, because of the many ages, we had a strong Jewish community. Is of course before the Second World War, we had 10 times more Jewish population here. After the Second World War, it became much less, but still we have many synagogues in Ukraine, and our Jewish communities is very active. And in Ukraine, there are some centers, for example, nearby Kyiv and in Western Ukraine, where traditional Jews used to come every year to commemorate the leaders who lived in Ukraine. And also we had Muslim communities. What is interesting comparing to Europe, that Europe, most of the countries in Europe, there were absence of the Muslim during the ages. In Ukraine, we had the presence of Muslim communities mostly on the Crimean Peninsula for ages. So the tradition to live together and to hear each other was for a long time present in Ukraine. So as you see, the religion landscape is very flourishing, and didn't consist of one only church who could dictate the leadership in Ukraine. That's why it pushed Ukrainian communities, church communities, to negotiate with each other. And slowly ecumenism starts to develop in Ukraine. And one of the most significant signs of cooperation between the churches is all Ukrainian Council of Churches and religious organizations, the official representatives of the churches which had with the state. And for example, when some religious leader will come into Ukraine, such as Patriarch Bartholomew or some other leaders, all the representatives, they usually have a meeting with this council of churches and religious organizations. And they, yesterday I sent you a paper which was elaborated and adopted by these members about the Ukraine, our common home, as a strategy of peace building initiative for the churches. Nevertheless, ecumenical movement was starting and flourishing in Ukraine, but it has to pass many stages because the seminaries only opened and the churches were opened, and people, their religious knowledge or religious practice was poor, and it takes decades for people to learn how to live with their own faith. Even right now, we have a lot of work. The churches have a lot of work to because sometimes Ukrainians call themselves Orthodox or Catholics or Protestants, but sometimes they need their personal understanding of their faith, personal when the religious influence my own life, not only as a sort of, I'm just telling that about my identity, but sometimes churches has to do much more to deepen their faith and their practice in their daily lives. Division, because the churches in Ukraine were a lot, and the diverse life in Ukraine was from the beginning. Of course, it was used by many politicians to divide country, especially before the political elections. The churches sometimes played some of the church communities played destructive roles. And now, looking back, we can see as politicians and some ideologists, especially from our north neighbor, try to use this division between the churches in order to find their own interest. And it happened also in the religious life when some of the churches became more and more closed in themselves. A big change happened during Maidan Revolution, as we call it, a revolution of dignity in 2013-2014. A president, pro-Russian president, was elected in 2010, I believe, 2009, 2010, and in the beginning, the whole nation wanted elected the pro-European vector of development, but Yanukovych was corrupted and had many links with Moscow, and in the beginning he also wanted to go to Europe, but afterward the influence of Putin, he changed his mind and tried to change its politic and make Ukraine a part of Russia, let's say. And all the people were against this, and it was a big rebirth of spirit during these 3 months of resistance with the power. In the beginning, it was non-violent resistance, because thousands and even millions of people just coming to the center. You can see the Maidan of Kiev is the main square in our capital, where people just coming from different cities and stay for 1 day, for 1 week. Some stayed during several months over there, and people bring food, give shelter. On the picture, you can see the shelter, prayer shelter for the churches, and sometimes a priest of one, a Greek Catholic priest could have a liturgy, and afterwards an Orthodox priest could have a liturgy. Sometimes Protestants come to this prayer shelter. It was very ecumenical movement within a grows up level movement, coming people together against those pro-Russian vector, but most of them because we want another type of even the religious life. We were against corruption. We wanted to people want good trials and laws in Ukraine and so on. So people were pushed by their goodwill, and this push was had a clear ecumenical dimension, because people on Maidan, for example, every day in Maidan was opened with the prayer and was closed afterwards also in the prayer. So during the night, many church leaders coming to that stage and prayed together with the people. So it was really like an inspiration. Right now we just rethink this experience we had during Maidan Revolution, and we think that it was like a sort of a spirit which influenced many people, and many theologians right now are thinking about theology of Maidan. So what was important about the churches, that before Maidan, churches struggled between each other, and they tried to be close to the state leaders, to the state, to use the state power to receive more, to have more, for example, opportunity to build churches, or to have some rights. But after Maidan, they understand that our task, the task of the church, is not to be closer to the state, but to be close to the people, to the society. And this serving to society was very important for the churches, and they understand that we are on the same boat, and we are living in the same society, and we are striving to serve those people who are right now in need. So it was a strong change, especially for the Protestant churches, which were very politicians before the Maidan. And after Maidan Revolution, they were involved to the volunteer work and helping people, and also to ecumenical exchange. 2018, the Patriarch Bartholomew signed a Thomas of Autocephaly, and he granted autocephaly to the new created Orthodox Church of Ukraine. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Instead of these two Ukrainian churches, which didn't have recognition, he created a new church where most of the people from these two Ukrainian churches and some people and bishops from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate joined a new created church. his hope was to have one canonical church on the territory of Ukraine. But because the Russians has its own plan, and one of the causes which that Russians create is they bring divisions, yes, in the political life in Ukraine and also in the religious life in Ukraine. So this Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate didn't receive this Thomas of the didn't participate in this council of reunited all Ukrainian Orthodox. So right now we have two separate churches. One Orthodox Church of Ukraine that has its recognition from Constantinople, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate, which is in connection with the Russian Orthodox Church. And between those churches is the influence, the relationships are not very good. There are some hatred and distrust between themselves. The Russian war in Ukraine, yes, and how it influences the churches. Several words about this war. This is the biggest war in Europe and in the world since the Second World War. And as I told you before, right now in global we had around 20 military conflicts, but the war in Ukraine is the biggest because all the weapons except nuclear weapon have been used in right now. Navy, airplanes, all types of bombs and missiles, and so on. So 7 million people left Ukraine, according to the statistics, and 7 million people are assigned to be an internally displaced person. So they have to move from the east part of Ukraine to the western part of Ukraine. So more than 10 people left their homes. 1,000 soldiers and civilians were killed. For example, in Mariupol, we can't count, for example, how many civilians died already because the city is under occupation, but the numbers of casualties come from 10,000 up to 30,000. So only one city, and in every occupied city, many people died in their prison without and we can't know what is happening right now with them. Many destructions, hospitals, schools, ordinary houses, and for example, right now it's a big problem of mines in Ukraine. So the territory which is contaminated by mines some experts says that it could be like a territory of Switzerland. So one country contaminated by mines, and it will take decades after the end of the war to take away all these mines. And right now you heard about the ecocide that the Russians made in Ukraine when they blow Kakhovska hydro station, when the water flow, and it was a big ecological crisis in Ukraine. In order to stop a little bit Ukrainians coming in advance. It's many experts saying that this is a genocidal war of the Russians against Ukraine, because there are several clearly signs which we can see. For example, denial of Ukraine as it is a true state. For Putin, it's a false state running by Nazis, and he never right now says that Ukraine or the government of Ukraine, they say it the Kievan regime. So even he uses another type of word. Negating that Ukraine is a separate nation. Usually Putin says that Ukrainians were invented by Lenin or Polish or whatever. Stating that Ukraine are not human, so dehumanizing the whole nation. So calling us Nazis, possessed by devil, and other words. And many. So, for example, when we when Ukrainians deliberate some of the cities, we find a horrible picture, especially, for example, you heard about Bucha or Irpin, small cities or towns in the north of Kiev, which were occupied, and they found tens, hundreds of casualties, dead people, civilians, which was no sense to kill them. They just was so brutally killed because they want to. The Russian soldiers wanted to show their power, and of course, it's not like one time happening somewhere in some city. It's like the whole process is a style of the Russian army behaving with the Ukrainians. Before entering the Ukrainian border, the Russians prepared 45,000 plastic bags. Guess why? For this people they wanted to kill here in Ukraine. So we can just guess. Last school we spoke about religious aspects of the war that Putin began against Ukraine. And we spoke about the involvement of the Russian Orthodox Church in this war, about this ideological background. And we spoke about the Russian Ruski Mir, Russian sphere of influence, Russian world. This ideology was first living in the religious circles, but afterwards the politicians and imperialists use the same rhetoric in order to create, first of all, to blame West in their decadence, and to say that West is going to decadence and it's bad, but the territory of the Holy Rus we had to restore, and this territory should be, it is a sort of holy land, and we have our own path to life and to bring light to all the world. But sometimes they bring in light with the weapon and with terrible destructions. This is a small icon for that the priest distribute between the soldiers, where it is written that your task is to delete the Ukrainian nations from the face of the earth, so something like that. So this is a sort of brutal imperialism that didn't stop against killing other people. What is worth to say is that from the beginning of the war, since 2022, in February, all the Ukrainian churches condemned the Russian aggression. Even the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate, in the face of its leader, Metropolitan Onufry, they condemned the war. And for example, Onufry said that it is a sin of Cain which will never be forgiven. And it was a little bit shock even for the Russian Orthodox Church, but nevertheless it didn't stop them. All the churches from the beginning of the war tried to help people in their needs because there were a lot of sufferings, a lot of fear. They, on the many parishes in Ukraine, there were centers for helping, for the volunteer help and humanitarian help, and many international partners were involved in Ukraine, and many international help came through the parish level, yes, to distribute different goods for the people which needed this help. Ecumenical challenges and opportunities happening because of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. So right now we can see a picture. It was taken in the beginning of this year, in the time of the ecumenical prayer for unity, which take part in every year in January. the delegation of the All Council of Churches and Religious Organization came to Rome for its visit with Pope and for the common prayer. And here you can see the leaders, the heads of the churches. You can see Metropolitan Onufry, the leader of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, newly created by Constantinople. You can see Patriarch Sviatoslav, he is a leader of Greek Catholic churches. And you can see Metropolitan Mokrzycki, Mieczyslaw Mokrzycki, who is leader of the Roman Catholic Church in Ukraine. You can see the leader of the Armenian community, Protestant leaders as well. And you can see a priest of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate, not bishop, not the head of the church, but only a priest. So it's like they participated, but some sort of strange participating in this Ukrainian delegation to Vatican. So let us look. I just on the conclusion, I will show you three main churches, and we'll see, we'll analyze the challenges and opportunities which appearing between those churches. So the biggest church in Ukraine was, before the war, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate, or they call themselves non-Moscow Patriarchate. They try to avoid mentioning them with Moscow, because many of the priests stopped to commemorate Patriarch Kirill during their masses, during the liturgies, during the masses. But nevertheless, structurally, it still during the Orthodox understanding, theological, ecclesiological understanding, this church is still part of the Russian Orthodox Church, because it is not recognized by other churches. So their unique recognition, canonicity link, they receive their recognition only through Moscow from other Orthodox churches. What are the challenges of this church? Many Ukrainians right now, because we are in conflict with Moscow, with the Russian Empire, are right now against this. For example, 54% in the beginning of this year of Ukrainians were for prohibition of this church. Why? Because this church was for many years like alliance of the Russian Orthodox Church. All the leaders received their blessings from Kirill, and leaders of the church, as also Onufry, had several visits with Putin and received medals from Putin as well. There were many of the priests, bishops were protagonists of the Russian world, Russian Ruski Mir ideology. So this church is very was involved in this soft power of Kremlin on the Ukrainian territory. Some experts said that this church became a hostage of its own leaders, bishops, because sometimes priests are not happy to be mentioned with Moscow Patriarchate. They just want a separation of the church. But the leaders of the church were raised, for example, in Moscow or St. Petersburg seminaries, and they are mentally, sometimes they think the Russian Orthodox Church. This church is also a hostage of oligarchs. Novinsky, what's his name? Oligarch Novinsky. It's interesting that he is one of the sponsors of the church. And for example, in May, when the church has its council, he was sitting together with other bishops. Nevertheless, he is only a deacon, but he is a sponsor of this, main sponsor of this church. So he was sitting on the first places. And the church is a hostage of its policy of canonicity. Before the Thomas of Autocephaly, this church was the only canonical church according to the Orthodox perspective in Ukraine. Right now, only canonical church is Orthodox Church of Ukraine, newly created, and this church canonicity of the church is doubted. The problem of this church is also that many leaders and bishops cooperated with the Russians. And for example, on some territories occupied by Russia, in Luhansk or Donetsk, bishops became a collaborant with Russians. And after liberation of this territory, for example, in the Kharkiv Oblast, they just flew to Moscow. And they were never condemned by the leaders of the church, and they just keep silence on their behavior. So a lack of metanoia, changing, self-cleaning. Sometimes the church leaders are very close in itself and are afraid to have any dialogue or with the representative of other Orthodox church or in other churches, and it's a problem for the church. Inside of the churches, anti-ecumenical movements are very strong. Even the leader of the church is theologian Cyril Hovorun is blaming Onufry that he is very anti-ecumenical. For example, this year, the head of the WCC, Jerry Pillay, came to Kiev, and Onufry didn't meet with him, but sent his assistant, Metropolitan Antony, to meet with him. It was for him, this meeting was very important because they blame Ukrainian authorities to take their churches or lavra from them. The consequences of not participating in the dialogue are raising, and it could be a big problem for the church if it will close itself, because everybody is wrong and only we are right, and making like a sect environment, it will not give a chance to raise, to change for this church. But there are also opportunities because there is a big request for the unification among the Ukrainian Orthodox in Ukraine, and a lot of priests coming from this church are very open to dialogue. And for example, there were a few meetings of the Orthodox priests belonging to two different denominations between each other, and they are trying to find their way how to come closer together, how to avoid the language of hatredness, and how to think to have, if not one structure, but to separate churches, but to find some communion with each other. So on the grassroots level, there are a lot of demands for unification, but the leaders are very against of it. Orthodox newly created churches, Orthodox Church of Ukraine. So there are one of the challenges is that the church is young, and sometimes they do not have all the structure necessary to start a good, serious dialogue within Ukraine, inside Ukraine, and also on the level of the world ecumenical movement. So there are several very strong initiatives, and they this church asked to be a part of the WCC, but because of the position of the Russian Orthodox Church, this question didn't receive its positive answer yet. This church doesn't have a recognition from the other Orthodox churches, from the all Orthodox churches, because around 5 or 7 churches recognized the Orthodox Church, but a lot of churches are afraid to give the recognition because they were immediately blocked by the Russians, and especially those churches, for example, as Antiochian Church, which were dependent of Russia politically and financially. They would never give the positive response yet. The lack of trained personnel. The church was raised within 30 years in their own ambience, and they didn't have opportunity to have ecumenical partners outside of Ukraine. So all the personnel were trained inside of Ukraine. So, and sometimes they copied Russian Orthodox Church in their seminaries and academics. Right now there is a big temptation to this church to be a sort of state church, prototype of the Russian Orthodox Church, because they feel themselves that we are only Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and Ukraine is considered as an Orthodox state. So we can blame that we are one church and we have to have more rights than the other churches. But it's not happening right now. But some of signs of such temptations is already appearing for the representative of the OCU. But there are a lot of opportunities for this newly created church. First of all, request for unification of Ukrainian Orthodoxy, possibility to choose an open time of Orthodoxy, because for many years, Orthodox Church of Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Ukraine of Moscow Patriarchate was very anti-ecumenical, and didn't have strong relations with other churches. This newly created church is built on the type as Constantinople, Church of Constantinople, which is very friendly with in dialogue with, for example, with Catholics and Protestants. So there is a possibility to choose this open way of development. And this church is delighted with the trust of people in Ukraine, because it's staying together with people, and this church has a lot of military chaplain in the army as well. Another church is Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. The challenges is that the church is in minority in Ukraine. There is only 10% of the faithful, of the religious people. And sometimes the position of Vatican made by Pope, for example, before the full aggression, the trust to Pope was around 60% between Ukrainians. After the Pope unclear sayings about the war, right now the position of Pope is less than 10%. So, and the position of Ukrainians towards Vatican also sometimes influence on the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, because this church has a communion with Vatican. But nevertheless, this church also has, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church has many opportunities, because it has a rich ecumenical potential and experience. For many years, the church was presented not only in Ukraine, but also in Europe, in America, and Canada, and it participated in different international ecumenical meetings, seminars, and conferences. This church has most developed structures in educational institutions. And for example, Ukrainian Catholic University is a sort of root of this of good initiatives from within this church, and many international possibilities. It has a big structure outside of Ukraine, which could advocate for to develop ecumenical relations inside and outside of Ukraine. So as we can see, this Ukrainian churches are doomed to dialogue, and if some of the churches are not want to participate in dialogue, it is a risk that this church could become a sect. So my last slide is about peace-building tasks for the Ukrainian churches. What the other speakers later will speak about concrete peace-building initiatives, but just to count some of them, I would say that since the beginning of the war, churches and Christians trying to stay close with those who suffered during the war. From the beginning of the war, staying close with soldiers, with widows, with those who are in hospitals, those who fear the war with the parishioners, with the IDPs, with the internal displaced persons. So churches are very social active in this field. The purpose of of the Ukrainian church is to work together to inspire Ukrainian people in their right to live in dignity and to fight for truth. So the most important message that churches provide to the Ukrainian nation is that every people, the dignity of the human, and as we call it, revolution of dignity, it's also about the human dignity, that this dignity was given to us by God, and nobody could take this dignity from us. This is the war for our own dignity as human, a dignity as the son and daughters of God. So it's very important. And also churches are saying to fight not just against somebody, but fight for truth, fight for liberation, fight to defend your own family, yes, to defend because of love to your own family, not because of the hatred to the Russians. Another ministry which is appearing before the churches is trauma healing ministry, because a lot of people would be damaged, would be seriously traumatized, not only veterans coming back from the war, but people are living, today is already 500 days of war. And you can consider that people living in instability. Some of the relatives are on the front line. Somebody lost his home. Somebody doesn't have any stability. And most of the society doesn't have any stability right now. And people are deeply traumatized. It will take several decades for people to get used in normal, let's say normal life. So this is the task before the churches, which are very important right now. And what the churches are doing is international advocacy and elaborating models of the last peace through justice and truth-telling, underlying the basis for integral development. So it's very important for the churches to have this advocacy, to underline that peace, that this war is a colonial war of Russia against Ukraine, that we should seek a lasting peace, which is based on the international laws and on justice, and not only to stop to froze conflict, because it's one of the risks is just to froze conflict and not to it will afterwards it will cause us damages much more than we do have now. So it's my short thoughts about the situation, religious situation in Ukraine, how the churches are participating in this war conflict, and what are the relationship between the churches. And I'm open to your questions, and also for your own reflections as well. So please.